Okay, so we have a system of equations and we want to solve it using row operations or using a matrix in order to get ones on our diagonals and everything else as 0. Okay, so there is not a step-by-step approach for how you need to solve this for every matrix. The biggest thing that you want to focus on is you eventually want to get one row where it's the 1 is in the place value that it needs to be and then everything else is zeros. Because once you get that, it'll allow you to work with the other rows in order to also get them in the same format. Okay, but in order to do that, typically it's easier to just kind of focus on where you can get zeros or getting zeros in the right place. And then if you can get zeros to match up, that'll be helpful as well. Okay, so it will take practice. Next week, we are going to do a ton of review on this stuff, so don't freak out too much right now. Practice them, and when you get some worksheets later on to practice these on your own, do your best, keep working with them, keep practicing them, but we will review this topic next week as well and do some more practice with step-by-step instructions. So here's my matrix that's already written down. I'm going to see about getting some zeros in the matrix. So I'm going to try to get a 0 in row 1. So my new row 1, I am going to get a 0 by adding row 1 and row 3. Okay, that would give me those middle terms. That middle term then will give me 0. I'm also going to kind of do two operations here at once, and I'm going to replace row 2 at the same time by adding 4 times row 1, so this original row 1. I'm going to subtract row 2 from it. Okay, so I'm using this first matrix here to do both of these operations. And in the end, row 3 should be the only matrix that's the only row that's the same as the original. So when I subtract, when I add row 1 and row 3 together, I get 6, 0, negative 1, 8. When I do 4 times row 1 and I subtract row 2 from it, I get 2, negative 1, 0, negative 1. Okay, notice that my zeros are not in the same row, but that's okay for right now. My goal is to try to get zeros in the same column, but I couldn't get that 0 in the second column because that's the place value, this negative 1 here. That's the value that I need to get to be a positive 1 in order to get ones on my diagonals. Okay, so this is the format that I'm looking for. Okay, that's what I'm trying to aim for. All right, so now let's see if in row 3, hopefully I can get a 0 in that middle column. So let's see what I need to do in order to get a 0 in that middle column. For row 3, if I add row 2 and row 3 together, that will give me 0 in the middle column for row 3. So the only row that's going to change is going to be row 3. Okay, so row 3 now becomes 7, 0, negative 2, 11. Now let's see if I can get 2 zeros now in row 1. See if I can simplify it. So in order to get a 0 in the right position for row 1, I'm looking at that third number. So I'm looking to get this to be a 0. So if I do 2 times row 1, and I subtract row 3 from that, that should give me 0 in that very last value. So let's go ahead and do that operation. Again, row 1 should be the only one that's changing, so we can fill in everything else right away. This will give me 5, 0, 0, that's what I want, and then another 5. Okay, so looking at this matrix, we have the zeros in the right place for the first row, but I don't have the 1 in the right place. So I'm allowed to multiply row 1, so I want a new row 1, and I'm going to multiply it by 1/5 every number in row 1. So that will give me 1, 0, 0, 1, and then everything else stays the same. Okay, so this is my goal, is to get one of my rows to be in the format that I'm looking for. And I have that now with row 1. Now I can use that to help me get all my other rows in the same format. But notice that in order to get there, we have to do a lot of jumping around throughout our matrix. If you can get zeros in the same column, that's often going to be the easiest, because when you add or subtract zeros, it's not going to change anything. Okay, so try to aim for that as a pattern too that you're looking for. All right, we can pick a whole bunch of different ways to do this, but let's just work through row 2 if we can. So if I need to get 0 in that very first column for row 2. So I'm looking to replace row 2. If I do -2 row 1, and I add that to row 2, that should give me 0 in that very first number for row 2. Okay, so I don't want to change any of my other rows but row 2 for now. Okay, so this will give me 0, -1, 0, and -3. Okay, so this looks very close to what I want it to look like, but not quite there yet. So in order to get that row 2 to be in the format, I just need to multiply row 2 by a -1. So everything is staying the same. I'm just basically flipping all the signs for row 2. All right, so now I have 2 rows done. Now I need to work through row 3. So I need to get rid of that 7. I need to get that to be a 0 first, and then I can work on getting that -2 to be a 1. So let's do 7 times row 1 minus row 3, and that's going to replace our row 3. So this will give me 0, 0. When I do 7 times 0, that gives me 0, and then I subtract a -2, this will actually turn into a +2, and then a -4. Okay, so I'm very close. Hopefully you can figure out the last row operation. I need to multiply row 3 by 1/2 to get that value to be 1. So every other row is staying the same. And by multiplying this by 1/2, I end up with 1s on the diagonal, everything else is 0, and then number on the other side of that vertical line. From this matrix, I know x equals 1, y equals 3, and z equals a -2. And that's my solution to the system of equations. You will get a worksheet posted with these videos. You have already solved a few of the problems from the video earlier this week, but try to do the other ones. Some of them are just row operations, and some of them are solving systems of equations using matrices. Practice them, but next week we will practice more with solving systems of equations using matrices, and then we'll also kind of review, do some review problems from everything that we've covered so far with weeks 1 and 3. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the week, and you guys will get videos then starting next week.